What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing the mysterious and very tragic disappearance of Susan Powell. Susan Marie Cox was born on October 16th, 1981 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, but she was raised in Puyallup, Washington. When she was only 18 years old and pursuing cosmetology, she met the man she would end up marrying, Josh Powell. Both Susan and Josh were devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they were also both enrolled in an Institute of Religion course for which Josh had been hosting a dinner. Within just days of meeting Susan at that dinner, Josh proposed to her. On April 6, 2001, Susan and Josh got married at the LDS Portland, Oregon temple, and they immediately moved in with his father so that they could save some money to get their own place. They were staying with him till they can get on their feet. Josh's father's name was Stephen Powell, and he lived in the South Hill area of Puyallup at the time. And though they had no issues at first, it became clear to Susan that the living arrangement wasn't going to be able to be tolerable for her in the long term. You see, Stephen made it known to Susan, and didn't try to hide it at all, that he was in love with her. He actually had talked to her about being able to share her with his son, like for the three of them. She had to suffer his advances, and when she tried to speak to her husband about it, he would shrug it off and tell her that's just how his father was, and that there was nothing he was going to be able to do about it. Susan was desperate to get out of there, especially once she realized Stephen had been going through her clothes and laundry and stealing her panties and undergarments. He would also secretly film her doing random things around the house, or he would film her sleeping, and he had a bizarre obsession with her legs and was always asking her if he could shave her legs for her if she had just shaved her legs, and also he would ask her if he could watch her put lotion on her legs after she shaved them. It's really gross, disgusting, predatory behavior, and I'm sure that it made Susan incredibly uncomfortable and could have even made her feel unsafe. I watched a documentary about Susan and her own sister-in-law. So Josh's sister and Stephen's biological daughter said that she believed Susan immediately when she told her how Stephen was treating her, because growing up in the house, women were treated like servants and objects, and the boys in the house were treated like kings. There's something about Josh, guys, when I look at the photos and videos of him that just, like, he irritates me. He looks like a man who whines about everything, and he just looks like a weak man. And before I even knew what happened to Susan and how this case turned out, I disliked Josh immediately, long before knowing what type of person he actually was. It's the reading of the energy. You can take one look at pictures of Josh Powell, in my opinion, and see that there's something off, there's something not quite right with him. It wasn't until 2 years after Susan and Josh moved in with Stephen that he announced his infatuation and obsession with her to everyone, not only in the home but in the family as well, including Josh and Susan themselves. This happened in 2003, so imagine the relief and elation Susan must have felt a year later in 2004 when she and Josh were finally able to get their own place in West Valley City, Utah. Josh seemed to be relieved too, and it looked like the two of them were finally on their way to the wedded bliss that had eluded them thus far due to his father's creepy and disgusting influence. Susan had no idea who it was she married, though, because remember, they had gotten engaged within days of meeting one another, and they married very quickly after that as well. She thought she was marrying a good, religious family man who would cherish and honor her the way she fully intended to do to him. Susan had always wanted to be a wife and a mother more than anything else in the world, and she thought her dream was unfolding right before her. She had no way of knowing that Josh had shown extreme possessiveness in past relationships, to the point that one ex-girlfriend, a woman named Catherine Terry Everett, had broken up with him over the phone after also leaving the state so she wouldn't ever have to see him again due to his erratic and oftentimes possessive behavior towards her. He basically treated her the way his sisters and mother were treated in his house growing up, like a piece of property he owned and could do what he felt like doing with. Just as his father had done and taught him to do, he treated the women he dated as though they were things for him to use and to play with and nothing more. In 2005, Susan gave birth to their first child, a little boy named Charles, and not too long after, in 2007, the couple welcomed their second son, who they named Braden, but the marriage at that point was already falling apart. Josh showed no interest in raising his children. He wouldn't help change diapers. He wouldn't make bottles. He certainly wasn't getting up in the middle of the night to help Susan so she could get some rest. One member of their family said that Josh was only interested in spending time with Susan and their sons if they were going to be doing something that Josh considered fun. Otherwise, it was mainly Susan who spent the time with and cared for the boys. At the same time she was having to do most of the work with the kids, Susan had gotten herself a good career as a broker and was trying to juggle everything with increasingly less help and support from her husband. One of the main issues for Susan in the marriage, and what seemed to be causing most of the problems at the time, was Josh's lavish spending habits. Also, there was a little issue of Stephen Powell still harassing Susan and still running around ranting and raving about his obsession with her, to the point where he told Josh that he should be sharing Susan with him and that the three of them should be a throuple, basically, as I already mentioned. Aside from the obvious issues with this scenario, was the fact that Josh always sided with his dad and continued to tell Susan that there was nothing he could or was willing to do about it. He also blamed Susan, at least partly, because he said that she was overly flirtatious with men in general and with his father specifically. In 2007, Josh declared bankruptcy with over $200,000 in debt he couldn't clear up. In June of 2008, Susan must have seen trouble coming and brewing all around her because she wrote a secret will which said that Josh had been threatening to leave the country with her kids and sue her should she file for divorce. She was afraid to speak publicly about it because by this point she feared Josh and what he was capable of, so she secretly documented these types of things. On July 29th, 2008, Susan went so far as to secretly video record all of the property damage Josh had caused around their home and property. Whether that be his whiny, bitchy outbursts or just in general when he was trying to remind Susan who the boss of the house was and who the boss in the relationship was. Guys, I just want to let you all know that I'm doing an overview of this case and there's so much more to the story than I could ever fit in a video that is aimed at being less than 1 hour, even though I did put a lot more than I normally do in this video. I could not do it. If you guys know me, you know who I am personally, you know what I do, my abilities. I had to do this video in this way. But I will say that the best coverage I found on this case is on a show on the Discovery Channel called How It Really Happened, and they have a 2-part show detailing Josh and Susan's life together and the torment and abuse this poor woman went through, not only at the hands of her husband, but of her father-in-law as well. So please check that out if you want more information into how all of this transpired. But I did fill out an extremely detailed timeline for you guys. So let's jump right in. On December 6th, 2009, Susan took Charlie and Braden to church, and a neighbor who had happened to drop by that afternoon just to say hello was the last person outside of the Powell family to see Susan Cox Powell. The next morning, on December 7th, the kids never showed up at their daycare, and no one called the school to tell them that the kids wouldn't be attending that day. This was highly unusual, as Susan was an incredibly responsible parent and woman, and she would never have just blown off taking her kids to the daycare without letting someone in authority at the center know. Not to mention she had worked that day, which is the whole reason the kids attended daycare in the first place. Josh didn't hold on to jobs very long, but he had no problem spending all of Susan's hard-earned money on his man toys and all the latest tech and gadgets, and also he couldn't be bothered to stay home with his kids while she was at work. Josh felt like what Susan earned was his, and because he wasn't earning any money, he had her hand over her paycheck every week to him, and he would give her an extremely small budget to be able to feed the family. Not to mention other things she would need for the home, for herself maybe. It was her money. One person who was interviewed who knew the Powells said that one time they offered the little boys a hot dog each, and they were extremely excited that they didn't have to split it in half and share it. Susan obviously didn't know what to do, and oftentimes in abusive relationships, it's easier to stay than it is to leave, but she was becoming fed up very quickly. Susan had it all together. She worked and made good money. She was an incredible mother to her and Josh's 2 sons, but Josh was an abuser and a manipulator, and since Susan had always wanted to be a mom and a wife, she felt for a long time that she would be able to work things out and that she would be the one to be able to change Josh and just finally get through to him. So in going back to December 7th, the daycare staff tried to reach both Susan and Josh to find out what was going on and why the kids hadn't shown up. They were supposed to call and they didn't, but the staff became even more concerned when multiple attempts to contact each parent failed. The daycare workers called the emergency contact listed for the kids, which were Josh's mother and his sister, and reported to them what was happening. Josh's mother immediately called the police. She knew Susan would never have been so irresponsible as to not call the kids in sick or whatever was happening. She would have let them know why the kids weren't attending that day, period, as is protocol. At around 10 in the morning, the West Valley City Police Detective Alex Maxwell arrived at the Powell residence in response to the well-checked call Josh's mother had called into the department after receiving the phone call from the daycare. He immediately noted that Susan's belongings were still in the home, meaning her purse and other essentials a woman would take with her, probably wherever she was going, and he also noticed that there appeared to be no forced entry into the home whatsoever. There was something weird, though, in that there were two fans that stood out to him as they were seemingly placed in specific and certain spots in order to dry two spots that looked like they had just been cleaned on the carpet. The police called Josh and he explained that he had taken his kids camping the night before and that he had no idea where Susan could be. Like, why are you bothering me with this? The problem with his story, and there were several, was that it was snowing and freezing and the boys were very little at the time. Why would he have left in the middle of the night in the freezing cold to go camping? Also, he took his sweet time in returning to the house, despite the officers and some family members waiting there for him the entire time it took for him to get back, which was from morning time. He got back at night. He wasn't or didn't seem concerned at all about what was going on, and in fact, he seemed more put out and agitated that he had to deal with police than the fact that his wife was apparently missing. When he finally got back to the house to speak with Detective Maxwell, it was 5 o'clock that night, and the children had backed up his story about going camping. Josh had no explanation for anything, including why Susan's phone was in his car, and yet he had been calling it, claiming to have been trying to get in touch with her. Investigators also found a bunch of tools in the vehicle, and they found the fact that Josh took the kids camping in the middle of the night in freezing cold temperatures on a school night very alarming and very concerning. The police went on to find a ton of incriminating evidence that showed it was very possible, probable even, that Josh and possibly members of his family as well had murdered Susan that night or around the time of the camping trip. Guys, this gets so much more bizarre, just bear with me. They found letters that Susan had written to her family and friends in January of 2008, where she warned them all about Josh. She said that Josh, quote, threatened to destroy her, end quote, if she ever filed for divorce. She kept the letters in a safe deposit box that no one else knew about it, and she said in the letters, quote, if I die, it might not be an accident, even if it looks like one, end quote. She was scared for her life with Josh and thought he was capable of killing her and at least making it look like an accident. On Tuesday, July 29th, 2008, Susan video recorded herself documenting all of her family's assets, which she said she was doing on the advice of her attorney. She said, in part, in the video, quote, I'm just covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that my assets are documented. I hope everything works out and we're all happy and living happily ever after, as much as that's possible, end quote. That video was recorded less than 500 days before she disappeared and was never found. On Sunday, December 6th, after taking the kids to church, Susan went home for that visit with her neighbor. When the neighbor left at 5 that night, Susan was lying down for a nap. The last call Susan ever received on her phone was from a friend at around 2:30 that same afternoon, and on that same day, Josh told people that he was taking his sons sledding. At around 8 that night, a neighbor saw him return to the house and he pulled into the garage. At 11:45 that night, another neighbor heard the car alarm going off inside of the Powell's garage. At the time, the neighbor said that all of the lights in the house were off. So more information also came to light about what happened on Monday, December 7th, the day Susan had been reported as missing. Between midnight and 12:30 in the early morning hours of December 7th, Josh said he left the home with his two sons, Charlie, who was 4, and little Braden, who was only 2 years old at the time, and he said he left when Susan had been sleeping. He said she had just been finished cleaning some anomalous red stains off of the carpet and had told him she was too tired and it was too cold out for her to want to join him in camping with the boys. Josh said he took the boys to Simpson Springs Campground, which is in a very remote area of the Utah desert. That campground is a 2-hour-long drive from their home in West Valley City, and the temperatures that night were below freezing. Now guys, I'm a mother of 5, 4 of them are boys. I would never in a million years allow anyone, including my husband or those kids' father, to take my very young children camping in those temperatures on a school night. It just wouldn't happen. And everyone who knew her agreed that Susan never would have allowed it either. She was fiercely protective of her sons and defended them to Josh all the time. They were her whole world, and she wouldn't have let them go out like that in those temperatures in the middle of the night. And I don't think any good mother or grandmother or parent would. Detective Maxwell actually broke into the Powell's home by breaking a window, but he had the permission of Josh's mother, Terica, and his sister, Jennifer Graves, to do so. There's body cam footage of the detective notifying the 2 women that the only way he could gain entry would be to break in, and he could only do that if they were willing to be responsible for the window he would have to break. They agreed to take responsibility and told him to do whatever he needed to do because they were concerned that there was some kind of medical emergency happening where maybe Susan and or the boys couldn't get to the door or to the phone. The police investigated and found Susan's phone in Josh's car, but the SIM card had been removed. Josh had no explanation for why that was there and tried to avoid being asked about it. He was incredibly angry about the window, and he seemed more concerned with the fact that the window had been broken than with the fact that his wife was seemingly missing. Josh was immediately taken to the police station for formal questioning. Here is where I am forced to let you all know that although he is, in my opinion, and in the opinions of most people who know about this case, guilty as hell in the disappearance of his wife and everything that came after it, the horrors, he was actually never charged in relation to the disappearance of his wife. The tools in his vehicle I mentioned earlier that concerned the police so much as to make them very suspicious were tarps, a shovel, a generator, blankets, and a gas canister. These things might make sense for camping, but under the circumstances, they just make him look more suspicious. During his interview at the police station, Josh was asked why he continuously wasn't answering his phone when people were trying to contact him about his boy's absence from the daycare and all of the subsequent calls made by authorities and his family. And his answer was that he hadn't brought a charger with him and had been trying to conserve the battery in his phone. Yeah, cool story, bruh, but the police immediately noticed that Josh's phone had been plugged into a car charger when they initially searched his vehicle. The police also had specially trained personnel interview the little boys, Charlie and Braden. Charlie backed his dad's story up to a degree by saying that they did in fact go camping that night. However, interestingly enough, he said that his mother had gone with them, but that she did not return with them. He told the investigators that his mother went where the crystals are, or something to that effect. This horrified me, as most of us in this community know that crystals come from underground and in caves. They aren't normally just lying there out in the open for the most part. 2 weeks later, Charlie's daycare teacher informed investigators that Charlie told her his mother was dead. Remember, guys, Charlie was 4 years old at the time, and that's sometimes old enough to remember things and clearly verbalize as well. I think the little boy was so traumatized and terrified of his father that he didn't want to tell the whole story, but I think he remembered and it ended up slipping out at least a little bit. The poor, poor little babies. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, said that while at daycare, Braden drew a picture of a van with 3 people inside, and when asked about it, he told the daycare workers that, quote, "Mommy is in the trunk," end quote. Finally, on December 8th at around 11 in the morning, Josh called Susan's parents to inform them that she's missing. He also told them that he's once again asked to go into the police station for more questioning. He seemed more put out and aggravated than worried or sad. At 12:44 p.m. on that same day, Detective Maxwell interviewed Josh, and the first thing he did was ask about some cuts that were on Josh's hands. Josh is sniffling throughout the interview, but no tears ever left his eyes. His nose didn't become red. He was dry crying, basically. Allegedly. At around 5:55 p.m., after all of those hours of questioning, Detective Maxwell wonders why Josh has just stated he wants an attorney. Maxwell says, quote, "So you're telling me you don't want to come in here and talk to me and answer my questions so we can try and figure out where potentially she could be," end quote, meaning Susan. Josh responded with, quote, "They told me that I should have an attorney because they don't know what's going on. They said I'm pretty much in over my head," end quote. Maxwell asks, quote, "Okay, you're in over your head because your wife is missing," end quote. And to that, Josh answers, quote, "Because you guys are already trying to trap me on the little things, like cuts on my hand, for one," end quote. Toward the end of the questioning, another officer enters the room, and this officer tells Josh that his story just isn't adding up. A few minutes later, Josh is read his rights and told that he is going to be detained. However, he isn't detained, and he is let go once the interview and questioning is over. The police took custody of the van Josh had been driving that night on the night Susan disappeared, and Josh ended up renting a vehicle at the Salt Lake City International Airport. He drove that vehicle, that rental, a total of 800 miles before returning it 2 days later. At some point during that 800-mile trip to wherever he went, doing whatever he did, he had purchased a new cell phone and he activated it in Tremonton, Utah, which is near the Utah-Idaho border. They still to this day don't know where he went 800 miles away, or I guess 400 miles away, because you have to drive 400 miles back, and what he was doing. That is probably the main reason why this case was never solved, whatever he was doing in that time frame when he was driving that 800 miles. He could have easily went, dug up Susan or gotten her body otherwise and drove 400, 500 miles away and buried it somewhere, and we're never going to come across it. That's just my speculation, but I mean, what else would he have been doing? On December 9th, the police executed a search warrant on the Powell residence, and they moved boxes, bags, computers, and on top of all that, they found some small spots of blood, which did later turn out to be Susan's. The police also found life insurance policies for $1.5 million on Susan, where Josh was the sole beneficiary. With the insurance policies was a letter Susan wrote, letting whoever found it know that she was living in fear for her life. They also searched the Simpson Springs campground for any signs of Susan Powell at the campsite. Josh claimed that he had used a specific campsite that night, so they checked there as well, the investigators, but they found no evidence at all that Susan or Josh or anyone else had camped in that particular area. Josh spoke with the media on camera that day, and he said, quote, "I've been trying to figure out what I can do so I don't sit idle, dealing with this repeatedly. I was just going to go in," and he motions towards his house, "and get my kids," end quote. So once again, at least in my opinion, Josh seems more annoyed about all of the attention his wife's disappearance is getting and the pressure he seems to be under about having to be accountable for what he said he was doing than the actuality of his wife no longer being around and nobody knowing where she is, what happened to her. Like I said in the beginning, a whiny, loser, little narcissist, garbage human freaking being. The reporter asked Josh how the kids were doing, and he answered that they're fine as far as he can tell. Then the reporter asked, quote, "So you came home and went camping. What can you tell us about that night?" End quote. Josh responded with, quote, "Yeah, a lot of times I just go camping with my boys, not anything big. We just go overnight and we do s'mores and stuff like that. I was planning on doing s'mores in the morning, and then when we got home, on the way home, I found out people were worried about us and that we were missing," end quote. On Friday, December 11th, the weather, a ton of snowfall, halted the search of Simpson Springs campground. On Saturday, December 12th, the Powells, the Coxes, and most of the community gather outside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Hunter Central Stakes Center. They sang hymns, they prayed, and they all began a 24-hour fast in the hopes that Susan would be found safe and returned home. Josh is seen tearing up and finally getting emotional about his wife's disappearance. Chuck Cox said he is concerned about how much the police were focusing on his son-in-law, on Josh. On Monday, December 14th, Josh hired defense attorney Scott C. Williams, and the next day he didn't show up for a scheduled interview with the police, and the police made a public announcement that Josh was getting in the way of their investigation into finding out what happened to his wife. On the 17th, all media who had interviewed and spoken with Josh Powell were subpoenaed to provide all of their footage of him to the police immediately. On Friday the 18th, Josh took Braden and Charlie to Puyallup, Washington, to stay there with his father, Stephen, quote, "for the holidays," end quote. I don't know how to pronounce Puyallup. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. One of my really good friends, she's probably watching this, is from there. Let me know how I did. On Tuesday, January 6th, after social media campaigns to find Susan had been launched by her family and friends, Josh and his brother Michael returned to West Valley, but only to make repairs on the home, as Josh planned on renting it out and staying with his father with the kids indefinitely. On January 29th, the West Valley City Police served Josh with a warrant, and they finally seized the blue minivan that he took the kids camping in on the night Susan disappeared. The night, if I could just remind you here, that her son said she was with them on the way, possibly in the trunk, but that she didn't come back with them because she is, quote, "where the crystals are," end quote. On Monday, February 15th, Susan's family held a press conference, and they revealed to the press and to the public that Susan had confided in many of them that she was planning on ending the relationship with Josh on their anniversary, which was only a few months away on April 6th. She wanted a divorce. She was done. She was over it. She was making her own money. She was financially independent. She was more than capable of caring for and taking care of the kids on her own, because she was already doing that anyway, just with Josh leeching off of her. She was able to do it all. But she wasn't doing it because she was under the thumb and abuse of this garbage man. Why she was waiting for the anniversary is unknown. Nobody knows that. But Susan also revealed to her family that on at least one occasion, Josh had been physically abusive with her. As we mostly know in this community, being physically abused almost never happens just once. Her family spilled all of this tea at the press conference and also revealed all of Josh's controlling behavior towards Susan throughout the years they were together. The Cox family also announced that they created a nonprofit organization called the Susan Cox Powell Foundation. According to this foundation's website, quote, the Susan Cox Powell Foundation was established in 2010 by Susan's parents with the help of friends and after an overwhelming response from around the world. There are email, letters, and Facebook messages of support and sharing of the parents with missing children, questions of parents concerned about their children in potentially similar situations, but without the support that we felt moved us to create this foundation, end quote. On February 25th, 2010, Josh's neighbors put up ribbons and Susan's missing person flyer all over the neighborhood to try to come together in support, I guess, for him and for his family, and to show their support of trying to find Susan. But Susan's family did say that it greatly upset her children, Charlie and Braden, probably because they had to see it and it served as a constant reminder of what they knew had happened to their mother, but that they weren't able to either remember and or tell. I don't know for sure that that's why they were upset about it, but I imagine that was a big part of their problem with it. On Saturday, April 10th, a group of volunteers once again went and searched the Simpson Springs campground area where Josh insisted he had gone with the boys the night Susan disappeared, but once again, the intensive and extensive searches of the area turned up absolutely nothing. On August 25th, 2010, the West Valley City Police Department released some data related to the investigation in Susan's case. The data reported that 6,850 man-hours had been dedicated to searching for Susan. The cost of the department up to that point regarding this case was $150,000, and it also showed that there were 5 full-time detectives assigned to Susan's case. The department only had 28 detectives in total at the time, so for them to allot 5 detectives only working on Susan's case, that's a lot. On September 10th, 2010, Susan's father, Chuck, along with Ed Smart, who is the father of kidnapping victim Elizabeth Smart, made an appearance together in Utah in order to promote legislation that would require those who are arrested for a felony to have to submit automatically to DNA testing. Monday, December 6, 2010, was the 1-year anniversary of Susan's disappearance. On that day, Josh Powell and his father, Stephen, publicly claimed that Susan had run off with a man who went missing around the same time as her. Y'all might actually know this man's name and his story, as I've written about it extensively for Missing Person and Mysteries, and I also covered his case in one of my Gone books. His name is Stephen Coker, and he went missing in Nevada in December of 2009. Stephen and Josh claimed that he and Susan might have run off to Brazil, and that Coker served there for an LDS mission at one point. They claimed they went off to start a brand new life. Guys, there is no evidence to back these claims up, and obviously, allegedly, and at least in mine and most people's opinions, Stephen and Josh simply made this up. The disappearance of Stephen Coker has also never been solved. Trust me, guys, it gets even worse and even more disgusting as far as the behavior of Josh and his sicko father. On July 15th, they announced publicly that they plan to release some of Susan's journals from when she was a teenager online for everyone to have access to it. This is obviously another way that this sick family is trying to embarrass this missing woman and try to make her look bad. Who wouldn't be mortified if something like that were to happen? It makes me so sick. You guys, seriously, so much of this case does, and I was just so moved by anger all of a sudden while reviewing this story that I was basically compelled to bring it to you all. I told you that. As I said earlier, just wait, because everything we've already discussed isn't even the half of it. On August 9th, a judge granted an order of protection for Josh against his father-in-law, Chuck. This came about due to an altercation that happened when they were both at a Lowe's home improvement store. I'm not sure what really happened, but I think Josh's father got in Chuck's face or something, but either way, both Josh and Chuck were eventually awarded anti-harassment orders against one another that required them to stay at least 500 feet away from one another at all times. On Tuesday, August 23rd, so 2 days after the police searched abandoned mine shafts in Ely, Nevada for evidence as to what happened to Susan Powell to no avail, and without finding anything at all, Susan's best friends, Kirsty Hallowell, came forward along with Josh's own sister, with whom he was estranged from, to let the public know that Stephen Powell had made unwanted advances towards Susan that were sexual in nature and obviously extremely inappropriate given the nature of their relationship. Stephen Powell quickly came forward to publicly deny those claims, but keep in mind here that even his own daughter came forward and stated that she believed that Stephen had done everything Susan had accused him of. On August 25th, the police served a search warrant on Stephen Powell's home in Puyallup, Washington, and they took computers, boxes, and bags from that home. Stephen Powell did an interview about it with ABC News, and here's some of what he said. Quote, "I shared father-in-law, daughter-in-law flirting with Susan and maybe some sexual touching or whatever. I just enjoyed it, frankly." End quote. Sick, sick, sicko. About a month later, on September 22nd, the police arrested Stephen Powell on charges of possessing child's porn, which they apparently found on his home computers. He was also brought up on charges of voyeurism after the police found thousands of images of young girls and women, including Susan Powell, dressing and undressing in various states of undress, and it was obvious these videos had been filmed surreptitiously without the knowledge of the females involved. Sicko. We'll talk more about this later, guys, but 2 of the girls were neighbors of Stephen's, and finally, due to all of this, Charlie and Braden were finally taken out of the Powell home, as Josh was living with his father at the time with the boys, and they were brought into protective custody. The state's custody, so CPS, whatever it's called in Washington, stepped in finally because the police needed to investigate whether or not anyone else was aware of or involved in Stephen Powell's voyeuristic and pornographic activities. I said cornograph, okay? The next day, on September 23rd, the Coxes filed court papers in order to get custody of Susan's diaries, which were in storage at Stephen Powell's home and therefore technically considered to be his property, but he was still, along with Josh, threatening to publish them on the internet. A judge made a temporary ruling that day that neither Josh nor anyone else can publish Susan's journals. On the 27th of September, Charlie and Braden were temporarily placed with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, after the Washington Division of Child and Family Services stepped in and filed child welfare actions. After 2 days in court, Charlie and Braden were finally temporarily placed with Chuck and Judy on the 28th. A couple of months later, after having custody of the children all of that time, on November 10th, Chuck Cox files a motion in court asking for a temporary guardian to be appointed for the boys so a custody investigation could begin. So just for clarification, because I was a little bit confused, the boys were placed temporarily with Susan's parents, but until that became permanent, the state had technical custody of them. So while they had physical custody, the Coxes, the state still made all the decisions about them. I don't remember what it's called. It's not physical, but it's all encompassing. I don't know what the term is, and I couldn't find it, guys. I think the Coxes just didn't want the kids around Josh, but knew that there was nothing they could do at the time to stop him from getting visitation because they were not the ones making decisions on the kids' behalf. They wanted full custody of those boys, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe. On November 14th, a judge set a custody hearing for Charlie and Braden for January 19th, 2012. A website was created a few days before that hearing by Josh Powell and other members of his family who supported him that alleged the boys were being abused by their grandparents, but it was eventually taken down on January 31st. Here's where the timeline gets kind of iffy a bit because I don't know what happened at the custody hearing on the 19th. I couldn't find anything about that. I do know that Josh was ordered only supervised visitation where the kids would go and see him in his home under line of sight supervision of a CPS caseworker. On January 31st, the same day the website about the Coxes was taken down, the police ended up finding hundreds of extremely disturbing images on Josh Powell's computer. Some of the images they found included those of simulated child pornography, bestiality, and that thing that begins with an I where you're doing naughty things with members of your family. On Wednesday, February 1st, Josh Powell is ordered to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, and that same judge determines that Charlie and Braden were to remain in the custody of Chuck and Judy Cox. At the time, Charlie was 7 and Braden was just 5 years old. Josh was ordered by the judge to undergo the evaluation by a court-appointed examiner, and it was found that Josh Powell had narcissistic personality traits, and this was said to have been shown by his absolute inability to admit even the smallest personal shortcomings and weaknesses. The examiner also found that Josh had, quote, adequate parenting skills, end quote, steady employment, and no criminal record. This is where the supervised visitation comes in, as this was the examiner's recommendation for Josh for the time being. So the Coxes put in the recommendation, or they filed the motion for Josh to have supervised visitation. Josh didn't want the supervised, obviously. He's like, I'm a good parent. He actually, I think there are videos of interviews of him saying, I'm a good parent, I'm a good parent. So he was ordered to do the evaluations before they would make the determination about it being supervised visitation. He got the evaluations, and they ended up deeming that he was required to have supervised visitation, at least for the time being, as he underwent whatever was recommended by the court to help with these things going on with him. I don't know what the results of the psychosexual evaluation were, or if that ever happened before what happened here happened. You'll understand later. I don't quite think there was enough time for them to get him to the psychosexual evaluation. So the whole time all of this was going on, Josh was regularly complaining that he was a good parent and that his boys belonged with him and not with anyone else. Elizabeth Griffin was the social worker assigned to do the supervised visits with Josh and the kids a few times a week. On February 25th, she showed up to Josh Powell's new home with the 2 boys in the car. It was also her responsibility to transport the boys from the Cox's custody to go and visit with Josh. This was line of sight supervision, which means Josh and the boys needed to be within her line of sight at all times during the visit. He couldn't leave the room or otherwise be left alone with them for any reason. She pulled up to the house, and the kids, being little kids who were excited to see their daddy, jumped out of the vehicle and ran to the door while Elizabeth was turning off the car and grabbing her things. Josh opened the door and let Charlie and Braden inside, but then slammed the door on Elizabeth and locked it. She tried calling for him and banging on the door, but he refused to open up and answer or let her in. He was now locked inside the house alone with his 2 small sons. The caseworker called 911 immediately when she realized Josh wasn't going to let her in and allow her to supervise the visit. I won't get into detail, but I'll say this. I am someone who hates most CPS workers, and I think they do more harm than good in most cases, at least in my own personal experiences with them. I believe that they take advantage of their power, and basically they can do whatever they want, or at least that's been my experience with them, watching family members go through things with them. I hate them. With that being said, I don't work in a situation where my hatred of and bias toward them would endanger anyone. If you all get the time, and I'll try to remember to link it in my description box, you should listen to the 911 call this woman made. The operator was nasty to her and very condescending, even as she told him she smelled gasoline and that she felt the children were in grave danger, that their lives were in danger. Before she knew what was happening, and before the inept 911 operator got help to Elizabeth, the house exploded right in front of her with Josh and the boys inside of it. 36-year-old Josh Powell had committed a double murder and deleted himself. It was later found that he had first tried to kill his 5- and 7-year-old sons with a hatchet, but when that didn't work, he decided to just blow them all up together. Stephen Powell was informed of the deaths of his son and 2 grandsons while he was in jail, and he seemingly was completely unconcerned with the news and actually got angry at the people who told him what had happened because he felt like they were berating him with it or bothering him with it. 2 weeks later, Stephen Powell invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to talk about Susan's disappearance or her case in general or at all. Stephen was admittedly obsessed with his daughter-in-law, and most people believe he knew what had happened to her and where her remains were. An investigation into Josh's rampage would reveal that he and his 2 kids died of carbon monoxide poisoning, and both children had chopping injuries on their heads and necks. It didn't take long for investigators to determine the fire was deliberately started after 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline were found in the house, and there was ample evidence that the gasoline had been poured all over and all around the home. On July 3rd, 2012, a minor came forward and said that a mine about 30 miles west of where Josh claimed he had gone camping on the night of his wife's disappearance had been filled up with gasoline and burned recently. This guy came forward a week after court documents were released that showed Josh Powell told a woman he worked with while they were at a work party of all things that, quote, the best place to dispose of a body is down a mine shaft, end quote. On that same day, the Salt Lake Tribune obtained and released emails that Susan Powell had sent to her friends, and one showed that in June of 2008 she wrote, quote, he's usually rude, yelling and barking commands at me, end quote. She also wrote about wanting to try marriage counseling, but that Josh was completely against the idea and completely disinterested. Side note, most of the time, 99.99%, narcissists will not want to go to counseling, and if they do go with you, they won't go for very long because they will make up a fantasy in their head that you and the counselor are somehow in cahoots out to get them once their narcissistic tendencies and traits start coming to the surface by a trained professional. Susan also wrote to friends about how controlling Josh was with her, with everything, even over very small amounts of money. She mentioned how he was so controlling with little bits of money that she was the only one working, the money was hers, and he wasn't doing anything to help to support the family. In one email, she seemed to quite eerily foresee future events. She wrote, quote, every moment I step back and take stock of what I'm dealing with, it feels like a never-ending cycle, but I'm too afraid of the consequences, losing my kids, him kidnapping me, divorce, or actions worse on his part, end quote. On Friday, October 12th, 2012, a 13-page report is released by Washington State addressing the question of whether or not Josh's murder-suicide could have been prevented or foreseen in some way. In this report, it suggested that the West Valley City sealed file about Josh, I think that's everything pertaining to him from the courts, the evidence from Susan, all the experts, his behavior up to that point, and just generally, etc., could have prevented the deaths of his sons. In other words, it should have been ruled he couldn't see them at all until undergoing all of the mental evaluations he was ordered to undergo, and, in my opinion, he shouldn't have been able to have had any contact with his kids at all as long as he was still a suspect in the murder of their mother, and also with how close he was to his father and all of the evidence of him being a pervert, and worse, they found in the home Josh and Stephen were sharing with the boys. The report stated the sealed evidence in part, quote, would have raised specific safety concerns for the children, but that information was not made available. It could have been used in assessing the need for services and the structure of contact between Mr. Powell and his children, end quote. The West Valley City spokesperson responded at the time by saying, quote, from the onset of the investigation into the disappearance of Susan Cox Powell, an emphasis was placed on the children's health, safety, and welfare. At no time did the West Valley City Police Department receive any indication that Josh Powell would murder his sons, end quote. I have some issues with the department's statement. I mean, they knew how much pornography was found on both Stephen and Josh's computers. They had Susan's emails to her friends and family and her written words saying she feared for her life and at times the lives of her children should she even consider leaving Josh and he find out about it. They had words and testimony from Susan's family and friends and even Josh's own sister, Stephen Powell's own daughter, who said she believed everything Susan said and she believed in everything Susan had been so worried about. In a way, the WVCPD dropped the ball because they didn't want to share information. On the other hand, I could understand, as that's usually how their business into investigations like this are conducted. It just so happened that this was one of the rare occasions where that information would have more than likely helped save the lives of two sweet, precious little boys had they not held it so close to the vest. I have no animosity towards them for that, personally. But in playing devil's advocate, I can see what people are talking about when they place some of the blame with the investigators. Let me know what you all think in the comments below, please, about whatever you feel moved to comment on up to this point. I am so interested in all the different thoughts, feelings, and opinions that this case is bound to stir up in you guys. And I'm not the only one. On Monday, February 11th, Josh's brother, a man named Michael Powell, who many people thought was somehow involved in helping Josh in whatever he did with Susan, whether at the time or with some sort of afterwards disposal, jumped off a parking garage in Minneapolis, ending his life and taking to the grave with him anything he might have known about this case. Michael had been interviewed by the WVCPD many times, and it was discovered through those interviews, and I'm sorry I don't have the specifics about how it was discovered, that Michael had abandoned a Ford vehicle of some sort in a wrecking yard in Oregon right around the time Susan had gone missing. That vehicle was eventually found, and through tests, investigators, and more than likely sniffer dogs, it was found to have at one time contained human remains inside of the trunk. On May 14th, the police department searched for Susan's remains on some property in Oregon, but they didn't have any success in finding anything. On July 1st, 2013, the WVCPD announced the end of the active phase of the investigation into the disappearance of Susan Cox Powell. They are adamant, though, that the case is still open, but they aren't actively investigating anymore unless new tips, clues, or leads come in. This was 3.5 years after she had originally gone missing. The West Valley City manager, Wayne Powell, told reporters, quote, "We have no further active leads to develop at this point," end quote. At this time in 2013, Mike Powell, no relation to Josh or the Powell family, was the WVC's deputy police chief, and he stated, quote, "Without a crime scene, just circumstantial evidence and no body, successful prosecution was not likely to happen," end quote. On May 21st, 2013, the Cox family was officially awarded control over their daughter's estate after Josh's mother and one of his sisters had continuously been pushing to have Susan declared legally dead so that they could collect on the very large life insurance policies. I believe this means that our family ended up with that money, but I'm not 100% sure. I really hope that they did. As far as Josh's sisters, one of them absolutely believed Susan when she said she was being harassed by Stephen Powell and basically was estranged from the rest of the Powell family because of how she had been treated growing up in the Powell household. She fought side by side to find Susan with Susan's family and basically denounced her own family. However, he had another sister, and she publicly told whoever would listen, including the media, that she thought Susan, quote, "knew exactly what she was doing," end quote, and that Susan was overly flirtatious with not just Stephen Powell, but with other men as well, and that she brought all of that sexual harassment onto herself with the way she behaved, and that she enjoyed the attention, even if it was negative attention. I don't know about you, but this sounds like when people ask a rape victim what they were wearing on the night they were attacked. So anyways, the latter was the sister who was in cahoots with the mother to get the life insurance money, and if I'm not mistaken, Josh had been trying to get the insurance money almost from the first time he was interviewed when he asked the detectives about how to go about collecting the insurance, allegedly. On July 13th, 2015, a jury found Stephen Powell guilty of possessing child's porn. He was 64 years old at the time and was on trial for possessing explicit images of two little girls in particular who were his neighbors at the time of his arrest. The girls were only 8 and 10 years old at the time, and prosecutors say the images were taken surreptitiously without their knowledge or consent by Stephen Powell through one of his windows as he aimed his camera into their bedroom and or bathroom windows. It's important to note here that Stephen Powell had already been convicted in 2012 of 14 counts of voyeurism. He had been convicted and found guilty of shooting videos in still images of those same little girls as they used the bathroom next door. A Superior Court judge had actually thrown the child porn charges out before the voyeurism trial took place, but it was all reinstated by an appeals court. He was guilty, allegedly, and he was eventually found guilty. On Friday, August 21st, 2015, Stephen Powell was sentenced to 5 years in prison for all charges, but was also granted 17 months of time served. On October 6, 2015, a federal judge in Washington state dismissed a lawsuit filed by Chuck and Judy Cox. They had sued the Washington Department of Social Health and Services and claimed social workers hadn't done enough to protect their grandsons. Big surprise here that these people weren't ever held accountable, as they never ever are. This next bit is exactly why those services infuriate me, as I said earlier. The judge ruled that federal law provides social workers with complete immunity from liability in order to make sure that the courts and others can pursue justice without fear of retribution. That's effing bullshit. It's bullshit, and I'm sorry, but there should never be any one human being or group of them who are deemed never liable for their actions or words, no matter what they ever say or do, ever at all. Especially here in the United States, okay? I'm sorry. That's one of the problems with this system. If someone was actually seeking justice, then there shouldn't be any worry about those seeking retribution. The problem is, and this is just my opinion based on experiences, these people now do whatever they want, whenever they want to do it, as they're now so incredibly powerful. Imagine never being held accountable for your actions by the law. That means if you're having a bad day, or for some reason don't like or have something against the religious views or political opinions, you don't like the way someone looks, of the person whose case you're overseeing, you could destroy their lives irreparably and be covered by the law without ever having to face what you've done legally. I've seen this happen where caseworkers took children out of homes due to one parent having an addiction to substances, and that parent ran into and filmed that same social worker on the corner copying the exact same drugs in the morning. This is neither here nor there with this case, but I think it's BS that 2 little boys are now dead and no one's being held accountable. Yes, Josh is the one who killed them, but there should have been at least some investigation into that caseworker, and if she did her job as she was supposed to and followed everything by the book, then she would have had nothing to worry about. The current standard is to never hold a light up to what these people are doing and how they're performing in their jobs. It disgusts me. And if I were to ever be an activist about anything, it would be to do something about CPS or whatever they're called and tighten the laws up around them. No one is above the law, except CPS workers across the United States. Sorry, rant over. Just to be clear, after hearing the 911 call the caseworker made, I don't believe she did anything wrong at all, except maybe let 2 excited little boys run eagerly into the arms of their father after not seeing him for a while. So I'm not persecuting Jennifer, whatever her name was, specifically. It's the system in general. Anyway, this was significant because in October of 2014, so about a year earlier, a judge had refused to toss the lawsuit, but upon appeal, it was thrown out completely and no investigation into the actions of the caseworker or the system of where she worked were ever conducted. On October 26, 2017, police announced that they had been able to unlock and go through every computer that was seized from Josh Powell, and there had never been any clues, except for one. There was one computer of Josh's that they still hadn't been able to unlock, and they even brought in a contractor, but that he had only been able to crack the first layer of encryption. They don't know if the computer holds any valuable information about what happened to Susan or not. On Tuesday, July 11, 2017, Stephen Powell was released from prison, and a little over a year later, on July 23, 2018, he died in a hospital in Tacoma, Washington. The sheriff's office stated that while they were aware Stephen was in the hospital, they were told that he was on the mend and he would recover. He died very suddenly and very quickly of a heart attack, and just like with his 2 sons before him, he took everything he knew to the grave with him. A spokesperson for the sheriff's department named Ed Troyer stated, quote, "I wish I could have talked to him before he died," end quote. This is actually very common in my experience where investigators want to talk to someone while they're on their deathbed because they try to play on the person's emotions and possibly their fear of the afterlife in order to get what's called a deathbed confession. I think it's genius, but unfortunately it wouldn't happen in this case. The next day, Stephen's daughter, Jennifer Graves, talked to 2 News about her father's sudden death. She said she was shocked and saddened, but explained that it was a different kind of sadness. This was the daughter who had been on the side of the Coxes the whole time and had tried her best to help hold her brothers and possibly her father accountable for whatever had happened to Susan. She stated in an interview, quote, "It's more of an emotion of not sad that he's gone, but sad that he lived such a poor life," end quote. Less than a week later, on July 28, 2018, Chuck Cox announced that he wanted access to all the files of the West Valley City Police that they had on his daughter's case. He stated to 2 News, quote, "I want access to all of the evidence and all of the case files so I can look through the whole thing. I have the right to have them divulge that information to me," end quote. His attorney then filed to get the unredacted versions of the police files. As this was going on, some tips came in about some mines in Utah not being searched yet, and searchers went out, but it was once again to no avail. I left out a few searches of several places throughout this video because they never led to anywhere, and there was no pertinent information about Susan's case that ever resulted from any of them. On January 10, 2019, the United States Court of Appeals for the 9th Circuit ruled that Susan's family is allowed to pursue a wrongful death lawsuit against Washington State's Department of Social and Health Services, or DSHS, overruling the court's earlier decision. I thought, okay, awesome, big win. However, it didn't matter because if you remember, quote, "social workers are immune," end quote, to everything and are never responsible for their own actions or inactions during the carrying out of their jobs and duties. Sorry, but it disgusts me. I'm choking back vomit. The reason the Coxes were so adamant about holding these people accountable is because they had asked DSHS not to allow the children to be in the custody of Josh Powell, as he was still the main suspect in the disappearance of their daughter, the boy's mother. We already went through what happened that day, and you should know that the authorities later said that Josh had left behind emails which he had sent just seconds before murdering his children and taking his own life in that explosion. And those emails made it very clear the deaths were intentional. The 22-page ruling states, quote, "The dismissal of the negligence claims against defendants, State of Washington and Department of Social and Health Services, is reversed and remanded because the district court dismissed them without according justifiable inferences in favor of the non-moving party, end quote. I don't know what that means. Any lawyers or anyone who could break that down, so I'm going to read it again. Quote, the dismissal of the negligence claims against defendants, State of Washington and Department of Social and Health Services, so CPS, is reversed and remanded because the district court dismissed them without according justifiable inferences in favor of the non-moving party, end quote. Friday, December 6, 2019 marked the 10-year anniversary of Susan's disappearance, and that's where we leave off. There's been no forward movement in her case, and it's still unknown what happened to her. I have so much to say, but this video is long enough, and I would just like to really know what you all think. Please remember that these are real people who went through this terrible tragedy, the obliteration of everyone with the last name Powell who was left, the disappearance of a young wife and mother, 2 precious boys murdered by the only parent they had left and were not able to depend on, either because of their father was such a narcissist that he thought of them as possessions because they knew something and remembered it and were old enough to tell someone, or both. And Susan and Josh's families are still alive and dealing with this unimaginable aftermath. I will say one thing I didn't cover too closely here, but the Coxes said the boys were very abused and emotionally brainwashed. They didn't know how to behave properly, and little by little, though, they would tell of the horrors and terror they faced in their home every day, specifically when they were left with Josh and Stephen Powell right after their mother had gone missing. A mother, mind you, that they had seen in the trunk of the family's vehicle the last night they ever saw her, and who knew more than I think they realized that she was gone. That information, the little bit I just gave you, came from a brief statement made by members of Susan's family on the show, How It Really Happened, and it isn't a direct quote, so I will say allegedly, because I can't remember verbatim what they all said specifically. It wasn't good, but the boys were thriving while in the custody of Susan's parents and while surrounded by her family. Someone should be held accountable for what happened to them, especially since her parents had asked time and time and time again for those boys not to be allowed anywhere near Josh until he was cleared in the disappearance and possible murder of their daughter, who was his wife and the boys' mother. But someone decided, as most CPS workers normally do, that they knew better about who Josh was and that they knew better what was best for the boys, and the boys paid the ultimate price. Some supervisor in an office somewhere who probably never met the boys, who never met Josh, who never met the Coxes, and who probably only had a peripheral understanding of the case in the first place, made the decision to put those boys in the danger they were found in that day. And it's despicable that whoever that was and all those who enabled them and enable people like them every single day won't ever be held accountable. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me. Spread the love, please, by sharing this video. This channel is growing so quickly. You know, my summer hours are very muted, but come September, I will be back to full work schedule. So just be patient with me until the beginning of September. I'm putting out as much content as possible. If you're wondering when the pre-recordeds are coming out, it's one every week, Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. I normally put the show schedule in the description box, but we're undergoing some changes. I'm actually interviewing people who might want to host on their own. You know, Steven will be in the background for the first few shows to make sure things go smoothly. So if you're interested in hosting a show, if you have a good idea, just because you email me doesn't mean you'll actually be able to do it. I'm looking for like 2 or 3 people. One of those people will be fill-ins for when like Lara can't make it or Steven can't do it. Just to bring your own pizzazz to the show. I would love to interview you, talk to you more. If you want to purchase any of my books, the links, the Amazon links for the Kindle, paperback, and Audible versions will be in the description box. If you click on, you know, paperback, you can see the Kindle and Audible right there. So I didn't put like all 3 links for every single book. Gone Mysterious Disappearances Part 3 is coming out very soon. I'm currently working on it, but again, with only 1 day a week to work instead of 5 or 6 like I had during the school year. It is really hard. I'm still head writer for Missing Persons and Mysteries as well. If you want autographed copies of any of my books, if you want information about personal intuitive tarot readings, either through video chat, generally and remotely, where you don't even have to be there, if you want to order one of my spiritual helper boxes or any of the sprays and scents, things that I handcraft to kind of spiritually tune you and your environment. There's black witch salt, there's bath salts, there's sprays. Guys, I have so much. Just email me if you want to talk about it, if you want to buy one of those custom built for you and whatever you're dealing with or facing by me packages. If you have any other correspondence, if you want an autographed copy of my books, if you want to be on one of my shows as a guest, or if you want to try to host anything, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Please check Gemma Jade out on Rumble and GemmaJadeYT on TikTok. I'm doing big things. I need 1,000 followers on TikTok to be able to go live over there. I am still doing my Friday night live intuitive oracle show at 7:15 p.m. Eastern every single week. That is one thing that has not changed for the summer. I can't really think of anything else. It's been a really long video. It's been stressful for me. It's been painful to go through this, but I really desperately needed to get this information out there. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today you're amazing, you should expect greatness. You should expect abundance, like you expect your mail to show up, right? I believe in you, and I got your back. Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.